Hello and welcome to another video. This is Jennifer McGuire and thanks so much for visiting. Today I'm excited for two reasons. First, in this video I'm sharing with you a new technique that I came up with and I call it distress stenciling. Along with that, I'm going to give you a closer look at the newest color added to the distress line. Tim Holtz hit it out of the park with this color. It's a brand new soft blue that is just gorgeous, and it's available in all the popular distress products. So I'm going to share with you first a look at the color, and then a look at some fun and easy techniques that you can do with stencils. But before we get into the video, I did want to answer a question many people asked about. In my last video, I mentioned we got a puppy and folks asked for a photo. This is little Abaco. Abaco is named after the islands in the Bahamas that we love so much that were just completely devastated by the hurricane. I've done a lot of fundraising for the Abaco Islands and for the Abaco Shelter, which is the animal shelter down there. So we named our puppy after that. She joins our other dog that we have named Foxy, and they are just as sweet as can be. So there's a quick photo for you. Okay, let's start out by looking at the newest color in the distress line. This is Speckled Egg. I have to say, when I saw this color, I was really excited because this is my color. My entire house is decorated in this color. It reminds me of the shallow water of a beautiful Caribbean ocean, or like an ice blue. It is this beautiful, soft blue that's not too green, not too gray. It is just ideal. The nice thing is this matches wonderfully or works wonderfully with many other colors in the Distress Ink line. And not only did he come out with this new color of Distress Ink, he's got the new color in the Distress Oxide ink, the Reinkers, the paint, all of it. So first is the Distress Ink itself and the Reinker, which I'll focus on today. Then there is the Distress Oxide ink. So this is a different type of formula. If you're not familiar with Oxide inks, I'll link to a video here that will give you more information. This color is now also available in the Distress Spray Stain and the Distress Oxide Spray. Again, I'll link to a video showing techniques with these. Then this Speckled Egg color is available in the Distress Paint, which is one of my favorite paint lines. Whenever I need to use a paint, I reach for that. And then the wonderful Embossing Glaze. I did a video on this recently. I'll link to it here, and I will use this product later in this video. There's one more product that's available in this color, and that is the new Tim Holtz Distress Pins. I'm a collector of enamel pins, so I'm really excited about this. There's this Speckled Egg Distress Pin. You can get it free if you buy this bundle of products over at Simon Says Stamp. I'll link to that below. But he's going to release a pin in all the different colors in the future, but for now you can get this one. And I'm really excited because that's one of the things that I like to collect in my craft room. Okay, now that we've seen all of the products available in this new color, let's look at the color itself. Over here on the left, I'm using Distress Ink. Over here on the right is Distress Oxide Ink. You can see this is a soft blue. Remember, this is fresh out of the ink pad. The Distress Ink on the left is kind of a dye ink, and it'll soften a little bit as it dries. The Distress Oxide on the right has a little pigment property to it, so that's the true color it will be. I wanted to compare this to other colors of blue, Distress Oxide, and Distress Ink on the market, so I thought I'd show you here. That is Tumbled Glass. This here is Broken China, which is a little bit darker. Again, we have the Distress Ink on the left and the Oxide on the right. Here is Cracked Pistachio, which you can see is much greener. And then the last one is Weathered Wood, which is like a grayish blue. And you can see this is more of a blue tone with the Speckled Egg. This Speckled Egg color will be the perfect sky color. So this is what I'll reach for now for doing soft skies or soft oceans. I didn't really know I needed this color until I look at this comparison. It's a really toned down blue that is beautiful for backgrounds or for blending with other colors, which you'll see in this video. Okay, now that I've given you a closer look at the new color of Distress Ink, let's do a fun stenciling technique. You can do this with any Distress Ink color that you have, but I think the Speckled Egg color is perfect for a soft background. For this, I'm starting with a piece of white cardstock. I'm using a heavyweight Neenah Classic Crest Solar White 110 pound. You could try any heavyweight white cardstock that you have. Along with this, you'll need a stencil. I really believe any stencil will work. And then a die cut machine. I'm using the Spellbinders Platinum 6 die cut machine. Along with that, you'll need an embossing mat. Most machines have one available. The Spellbinders comes with it, and it's this tan embossing mat that is a little flexible and allows you to make an impression with the die instead of cutting with a die. Now I'm taking my white cardstock and covering it completely with Speckled Egg Distress Ink. I'm taking the ink pad directly to the cardstock so I can put as much ink on there as possible. The more the better for this technique. Now I'm going to take the ink cardstock and put it on top of my embossing mat in my die cut machine. I'm simply following the instructions for my machine to make an impression with the die instead of cutting with it. All machines can do this. Next, I need part of a baby wipe. I use Kirkland brand, I'll link to those below, and I just cut the baby wipe in half. Any baby wipe should work here, or you can spray a paper towel to do this. I'm putting my stencil on top of my inked cardstock, and then the baby wipe on top of that. Then I'll put my embossing plate. I'm just following the instructions that I would do to normally make an impression with the die, but this time I have a stencil and a baby wipe in there. I'm going to go back and forth through my die cut machine. I go back and forth 4, 5, 6 times, kind of slowly. And what happens is it presses that baby wipe into the distress ink background. Remember, distress ink reacts when it comes in contact with moisture or water. So now I'm going to heat set this to dry it. You could leave it aside to dry on its own. I'm impatient, so I'm heat setting it. And look at this beautiful texture that you get. It gets whiter in the area that was open on the stencil, and it gets a little texture to it. I'm going to do some more examples to show you. But all I used here was distress ink, a stencil, baby wipe, and my die cut machine. Most of us have those things on hand. Okay, let's do another example here. I have another inked surface, so that's the same Speckled Egg ink covering my cardstock. I put it on my embossing mat, and on top I put the Poppy Stamps Romantic Bloom stencil. On top of that, I put half of a baby wipe, the embossing plate on top, and I'll run that back and forth a few times. When I take this out and heat set it, the area that was open on the stencil looks softer. It almost looks like there's tissue paper glued in that pattern on top of our blue background. It's wonderful and soft and has this great soft texture in real life. This is a wonderful way to quickly create a textured background using a stencil and distress ink. Okay, here's another example. I did the same thing. I covered white cardstock with the distress ink, put it on an embossing mat, a stencil on top, running it back and forth a few times through my die cut machine. And when I take it out, here you have another pattern. This was the Simon Says Stamp Peony Bouquet stencil. It's a great way to get more out of the stencils that you may have on hand. What I like about this technique is it's a great way to create a subtle, soft background. So if you have something you want to keep in the focal point on top, it's perfect for that. Here's another, but this time I covered my white cardstock with Evergreen Bough Distress Ink, which is a darker green color. On top, I put the Brutus Monroe Rainbow Stencil, then a baby wipe, the embossing plate, and I'll go back and forth. The reason I'm using a different color of distress ink is I wanted to show you this works with any color of distress ink you have and is actually more impactful with the darker colors than the lighter colors. With the darker colors, you see more of a contrast. With the lighter colors, it's a softer look. Here you can see how the baby wipe creates that light area in that pattern. And then the same stencil, but with speckled egg on the right. So you can get different looks with different colors. You can do this with Distress Oxide inks, but I do find that the results are more impactful if you use the original Distress ink formulation. Okay, for this background, I started by covering white cardstock with the Speckled Egg Distress Ink, direct to paper as I did before. Then I came in with the Evergreen Bough Distress Ink and blended some on the bottom for an ombre look. I've put that on top of my embossing mat in my die cut machine. Then I put a stencil on top of that, half of a baby wipe, and then the embossing plate. And I'll go back and forth a few times slowly. This time we have a blended color. You can blend any colors of distress ink. I just think that the speckled egg with that evergreen bough is just beautiful. Since the speckled egg is kind of between a blue and a green and a gray, it blends nicely also with weathered wood and peacock feathers and broken china. Here I'm just heat setting it so you can see the amazing impact you get by pressing that baby wipe through the stencil onto the distress inked background. Gives a beautiful texture on those raised areas. Now, if you do not have an embossing mat or the capability to make an impression or dry emboss with a die with your die cut machine, another option is to take your inked background, put a stencil on it, and then a baby wipe, and run that through your die cut machine as if you were die cutting cardstock with a wafer thin die. The pressure will give a softer look through the stencil. It won't give as much of an impression or texture to it, but it does work, so you can try that if you wanted. Okay, here is another example. This is a Tim Holtz stencil. It's so beautiful. I've used it before. I have my inked cardstock, the stencil, half a baby wipe, the embossing plate on top, run that through, and look at this gorgeous look. On this inked background, I covered it heavily with Speckled Egg Distress Ink. And then I put a little bit of the evergreen bough onto the right side there with an ink blending tool. So you can ink up these backgrounds however you want. Just the more ink you put down on your cardstock, the better before doing the stenciling technique. Okay, my next example, I started with a piece of white cardstock. I covered heavily with speckled egg, and then I put some evergreen bough on the outside edges, all four edges, with an ink blending tool. I now have that on my embossing mat, and then an Altenew stencil on top of that. Then we'll put half of a baby wipe, then the embossing plate, and go back and forth a few times through the machine. Again, if you don't have baby wipes, you can also use half of a paper towel that you mist lightly with water. I just find the moisture in a baby wipe to be perfect for this technique. Keep in mind, you could do this with any colors of distress ink. You could put down a heavy layer of rainbow colors on a background and do it anything you want. I was going for soft blue backgrounds for all of today's cards. On this example, I covered white cardstock with Speckled Egg Distress Ink, going direct to paper as I showed you before. Then I used an ink blending tool to apply some evergreen bough towards the center. And now I'm putting on a Simon Says Stamp circular lace stencil, then half a baby wipe and the embossing plate. I wanted to show you that you could do this technique with a variety of stencils, some with bigger open areas, some with detail. It doesn't matter. It works with all of them. Look at the great texture that you get here with a lace, very detailed stencil. Absolutely beautiful, and again, it looks like you put tissue paper in that great pattern on top of an inked background. Okay, now that we have created all the backgrounds with the technique, let's go ahead and turn these into cards, and I have some tricks to share with you along the way. Let's start with the example that you see here. I trimmed my inked background down to 4 by 5 1/4, and I'm putting a bit of liquid adhesive on the back and adding it to a top folding 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch white note card. Once I have it pressed down, I take my bone folder and run along it just to make sure that everything adheres nicely and I get a nice smooth background. There is that soft texture thanks to this technique, but there aren't any wrinkles in the background or any kind of warping. For the focal point on this card, I used a few different dies. This is a new memory box circle die set that creates these unique frames. They're very detailed and nice for adding a little something interesting to your card. I used one of those along with the Poppy Stamps Whittle spinner die. This doesn't actually cut a shape, but instead creates those little marks in a fun pattern. So I die cut the frame 3 times from white cardstock, and I'll glue those together for a dimensional look. Then I took one of the center pieces from one of those die cuts, and I'm taping it on to this Whittle spinner die, running that through my die cut machine, and I get that fun pattern to go in the center. But before I glue that to my card, I want to get my sentiment ready and make sure it goes nicely with it. I wanted to cover it with the embossing glaze from Tim Holtz that's in this beautiful speckled egg color. So I have some white cardstock here that I pressed Versamark embossing ink onto, and then I added some of the Speckled Egg Distress Embossing Glaze. This is a tinted clear embossing powder that's really special because it gives this glazed look to your cardstock. So if you put on more than one layer of it, it would get darker. If you stamped underneath it, the stamping would show through. It just basically gives a shiny tint to your white cardstock. And it'll match my background nicely because I use the same color from the Distress Ink line. Now from that embossed area, I'm die cutting Thank You from this Doodlebug die set. I really like Doodlebug's designs, and the Thank You was perfect for this card. Now that I like all the different pieces that I have, it's time to glue them together. Here I have the stacked frame die cut. So there's 3 die cuts glued together. I'm adding that towards the top center of my card. Then I have the center piece where I use that pattern die on, and I'll pop that in place. And then we have our thank you sentiment. I decided that thank you was a little too light. I could have left it as is, it's a perfect match, but I wanted it to stand out more. So I put it on a piece of temporary tape, pressed more Versamark ink on top, added another layer of Distress Embossing Glaze, and I'll heat set that. That makes the color the same, just a little bit darker. Once it's cooled, I removed it from the tape, added liquid adhesive to the back, and put it right at the center of my circle. To finish off the circle, I added a few white pearls along the pattern just for a little accent. And there you can see that soft looking textured background that we get from Distress Ink. And then the thank you that has the embossing glaze on it that matches perfectly with the background. I really like how the moisture from the baby wipe and the impression from the stencil gives you the texture and that tone-on-tone look in the background. Okay, here's another example. This is where I used the Peony stencil. On this one, I wanted to keep it very simple, so I used the Simon Says Stamp Beautiful Butterfly Stamp Set. This is new, and it is just a classic set with beautiful butterflies and sentiments that are great for stamping in the center of a circle or a frame die cut. I'll be using this throughout the video, and on this particular card, I white heat embossed one of the butterflies on vellum. And I also white heat embossed that thinking of you message on dark green cardstock. This happens to be Lawn Fawn Rainforest cardstock. So beautiful with this light blue speckled egg ink. I have my sentiment and my butterfly that I'm gluing right there towards the bottom center of our background, which, by the way, I matted on the Lawn Fawn Rainforest cardstock and added to a white note card that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Here you can see how it looks like my vellum butterfly is floating on the card. The only thing holding it in place is that sentiment strip. It's a great way to hide your adhesive. You can also see the texture in the flowers that we get from this stenciling technique. And then I added some Studio Katia Arctic pearls. Those are those white iridescent pearls, which match nicely with just about any background. It's a nice, subtle, but interesting accent to add to any card. Okay, my next example is the first one that we made where we used that daisy stencil in the background. So I thought for an accent on this, I would use the Pink and Main Daisy dies. So this die set actually includes that daisy, 2 centered dies, which I'll show you in a moment, and a leaf. I die cut 3 of the daisies and glued them together as you see here, all from white cardstock. Then I layered the 2 center pieces and die cut 2 leaves. I thought this layered white die cut would be fun for a simple accent against this background, and it allows that color in the background to really stand out. And there you can see the complete die set. Now for a sentiment, I wanted to stand out a bit but not be too distracting, so I decided to use holographic cardstock. Simon Says Stamp has this assorted holographic cardstock pack. Look at the different types included in it. Very different looks. Well, I decided to use one of these to die cut Friend from. Now, these are pretty bold, as you can see here, but if you use them in small amounts, they're great on a card because they grab the light and pretty much match whatever you already have on your card. So it's fantastic for adding a bit of interest to your card. I die cut Simon Says Stamp Friend from the holographic cardstock and glued it to the white shadow die that comes with that set. So there you can see how it has that holographic interest, but not too distracting like the full sheet is. I glued that on top of my daisy, and then I also added a few leaf die cuts underneath it and some of the Studio Katia Arctic pearls. I added that onto a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch top folding white note card, and there we have our completed card. When you look closely, you see the shine of the friend sentiment, but you also see that soft texture that we get from the stencil technique. Basically, pressing the moisture from that baby wipe onto the distress ink causes the reaction which softens in that pattern. All right, here's another example where I did the poppy stencil. I trimmed that down, added it to a top folding 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch note card, and put 2 Rainforest Lawn Fawn cardstock strips above and below. By just gluing those strips above and below, it looks like we matted that entire piece, but we didn't waste that much cardstock. Now here I have a Simon Says Stamp sentiment strip. These are pre-printed sentiments that you cut down and add to your card. I cut 3 cardstock scraps to go behind it. Use liquid adhesive to glue that onto my card. By putting the cardstock straps behind it, it gives it dimension that's very strong and will hold up as going through the mail. I use liquid adhesive to glue that to my card, along with more of those Studio Katia Arctic pearls. You can see how those pearls have an iridescent look to them that pick up the blue color from the background. And by the way, I use that Lawn Fawn Rainforest cardstock. It's like a dark bluish green. That works great with the speckled egg, but I found also if you use like a powder blue, it works great with it, or if you use a gray, it works great with it. This is one of those blues that works with many different shades of blue and green and gray to give whatever look you want. Okay, here's another example. This is that soft rainbow background. For the center of this, I use the Spellbinders Essential Rectangle die set. Really like this die set. It comes in circles and squares too. It has the frame die cut, and then slightly smaller than that is a frame that creates little open circles. So you can use them together or separately. And I love that you could stitch this if you wanted to. I also used the Simon Says Stamp Eucalyptus Leaves dies, a favorite of mine that I've used many times. I die cut the big one 3 times from white cardstock and once from the holographic cardstock I showed you before, and glued those together for dimension and added it to that essential frame die cut. I also added a Thinking of You sentiment from the butterfly stamp set that I showed you, and then also some of those Arctic Studio Katia pearls. So this distress stencil technique is not only fun because you can use it with any colors and any stencils, but you can use it for the background of any style of card. Here I just used some die cuts that I've been wanting to use and put it right at the center. Now my last card was Speckled Egg on the background. This one is that Evergreen Bough that I think is so beautiful, and it just shows you that any distress ink will work with this technique. And the darker colors seem to even stand out more if you want a more bold background. For the sentiment and the sentiment strip on this card, I used the Concord & Ninth Stitched Blooms stamp set and coordinating die set. I've used this before in videos and will use it again later in this video. I used the stitched rectangle die from the die set along with the Miss You from the stamp set for this particular card. One of the things I like about Concord & Ninth's stamps and die sets is there's more to it than just the coordinating dies. They add a lot of interesting dies to their sets. I'm also using the Poppy Stamps Delightful Daisy die, one of my favorites that I've used before. It's a beautiful design. I die cut that 3 times from white cardstock and glued them together and added it to my card along with the Miss You sentiment banner. I also added more of the Studio Katia Arctic pearls and then added it to a white note card. Here you can see how the baby wipe that we put over the stencil softens the look of the distress ink. So it looks like you have 2 colors on the background, a light and a dark, but really it was just one application of ink. That's the fun thing about distress inks. When they come in contact with water or moisture, they soften, they react with it. By the way, if you don't have distress inks, you can do this with some dye inks that react with water. Just give it a try. But distress inks are definitely a must-have in your crafty stash. Okay, my next example is super simple, and it allows a lot of that background that we created with the lace stencil to show. Now I trimmed it down, added it to a white note card, and then put the dark green cardstock strips at the top and the bottom. At the center, I white heat embossed a little note on a circle die cut, and that a little note sentiment is from the butterfly stamp set that I showed you from Simon Says Stamp. On the background, I also added pearls to the pattern. It helps to kind of make that pattern stand out more and doesn't distract from the sentiment in the center. I really like that soft look that particular stencil gave. Okay, now we have the example where we did that ombre look from the evergreen bough on the bottom to the speckled egg on the top. For this, I just trimmed it down, added it to a white note card, and then I used that Concord and Ninth Stitched Blooms stamp set and coordinating die set. For that centerpiece there, I silver heat embossed the message, and then I added some soft pool gemstones as little accents in the corners. I like sentiments like this that work on any background and work for any occasion. Okay, and then we have the background that I created with the Tim Holtz stencil. I again kept this simple just to keep the focus on the background. I trimmed down the sides a bit and added cardstock strips along the edge. Then I die cut a heart for the sentiment, and the beautiful friend is from that beautiful butterfly stamp set from Simon Says Stamp. I had that little heart die cut left over. I covered it with some glossy accents and added it right below the sentiments, along with a few pearls in the background. So there you have it, a way to use your stencils along with a distress inked background and a baby wipe to apply pressure moisture to create a really cool tone-on-tone background look with texture. It's really fun, really easy. I hope you'll give it a try. If you are interested in the products that I talk about, I always link them below my YouTube description, making it easier for you to find. And also, I will link to my blog post where I have information about a discount code and giveaway for the time this video went live. Thanks for spending this time with me. Take care, and I'll see you again soon.